This is not a tutorial channel. Originally, this channel was created to showcase my work, my social media, and my assets. However, I believe we could share our experience by talking about creative process, tools, and art in a general context. With that said, hello and welcome to Red House Tree. My name is Ramon, and today I'm here to talk about my almost 5 years of experience with Blender. Well, let me start by breaking a very common stereotype about people who've been doing 3D art for some time. I know many people think that if someone has few years of experience in 3D, they automatically know how to create ultra-realistic models, more real than reality itself, and in my case the answer is no, but I will explain why. Many beginners in art focus on hyper-realistic results because they see that as the highest achievement, but it doesn't work that way. As you learn and practice, you grow not just technically, but as an artist. And over time, you find your own unique style which makes you more comfortable with your work. In my case, when I started learning 3D modeling, I already had two things in mind. The first was that I didn't want to create hyper-realistic art because I'm not a big fan of trying to replicate reality. Personally, I find it boring, and I also think that this type of art tends to age poorly, but that's just my personal opinion, not a rule. The second thing was that I wanted to focus on creating environment rather than character. At this stage, while I truly enjoy creating environment and designing settings, I must admit that insecurity played a role in my decision. In the beginning, I didn't believe I could match the skills levels of the incredible talented artists I saw around me. On top of that, my limited perspective at the time made me place more value on realistic characters than on stylized ones. That mindset was a clear mistake and held me back for a long time. So my tip here is the most cliché one possible. Don't limit yourself before even begin. The only way to truly know if you're good at something is to give it a try. Let me share a bit about why I started using Blender. Believe it or not, it all began with Roblox. Yes, that game kids play when they're not playing in Minecraft. I've always loved games and was curious about how they were made. Even before my teenage years, I was experimenting with RPG Maker. I spent a few years working on projects there, but I never finished any because I felt those games weren't truly mine. They didn't include my own art, and at the time, I figured programming was far too complicated, and honestly, I still do. Which is why I choose to focus on a 3D model instead, but enough motivation, I can manage. A few years later, as an adult, a friend of mine noticed me how much money people were making by creating content for Roblox. One day, he came to me with an idea to work on projects within the game, but once again, we faced the same issues. Nothing felt like it was really ours. The assets weren't original, and the scripts were mostly copied from some YouTube tutorial. That's when we both decided it was time to learn to how create our own content, and he introduced me to Blender. Even if my friend uses ZBrush, the only modeling program that I worked on my 7th Gen i3 laptop with 4 GB of RAM was a Blender. And yes, I'm still using the same laptop today, but now with an SSD and 12 GB of RAM, which improves things a bit, but even so, rendering a 4-second video still takes 48 hours. And that's an accurate statement because this very video took exactly that long to render. And even worse, I rendered it incorrectly. It was supposed to have a transparent background, but it didn't. That's just how it goes sometimes. Despite this hardware limitation, Blender performs remarkably well on my setup. Of course, some tasks take far longer than ideal, so I often ask my friend to render my videos, but for the most part, it's worked fine for what I need. When it comes to learning Blender, I started almost 5 years ago. My first project was inspired by off the YouTube tutorial videos. Since I've never really liked donuts, I decided to make a Captain America shield instead. It turned out to be a great learning experience. Of course, I was overjoyed with the results, feeling like I had become the next Van Gogh overnight, but reality hit hard when I tried to create something on my own and failed miserably. The frustration was so intense that I almost gave up entirely. I think we've all been there at the start. Luckily, I got past it and I began focusing on simple objects, which helped me practice apply what I did learn and improve my planning skills. Speaking of planning, whenever you are about to create a model, it's always a good idea to plan how you intend to achieve the expected result. Otherwise, you might end up like I did with my first solo project, which was a slime with 4 million vertices. I saved, and I can't open it again cause it became too heavy. To give you an idea, here's a replica of that slime I made shortly after. Since even my friend couldn't open the first version without crashing. As you can see, this one also has an absurd amount of vertices because I had no idea how detrimental this was to my project performance. When it comes to learning, I always been the type to jump straight to the point, often skipping or ignoring the explanation in tutorial videos. This means I often learned the hard way what I had, overlooking the teaching process. Planning, however, can take many forms. Sketching, using simple objects to get a sense of spacing, or even ask yourself how many vertices you intend to have in your project. Setting personal limits can help you optimize your work. For example, since I create assets primarily for a game, I try to keep any rare character I make under 10k vertices. For a non-game project, I allow for a bit more. Optimization is always important, not just for a game, but also for rendering animation or scenes. Take my asset library as an example. It currently contains 229 objects with a total of about 130k vertices. That's roughly 567 vertices per object, far from my occasional 10k limit for a character. Comparing these numbers show how much you can achieve with 10k vertices. Just to clarify, this 10k limit is my personal threshold. Born out of necessity due to my weaker hardware, I had to learn to optimize my projects. Overall, it's a solid tip to evaluate your project's purpose and set appropriate limits. Another great tip is to always look for reference. Don't be afraid to use them. In the beginning, many people, myself included, think that to create something original, you can't draw inspiration for anything else. That use reference is just another excuse for copying, but that's not how it works. Reference provide a perspective on what your final result could look like. Sometimes, we want our character to strike a specific pose, but don't know exactly how to achieve it. That's where reference come in handy. You search for similar poses and use them as a guide to reach your desired result. The same goes for lighting, location, general environment, and even coloring your character. So, whenever possible, spend some time looking for reference. You can find it on Pinterest, ArtStation, or even just on Google. There are plenty of image sites out there for you to explore. Another thing I've learned is to look for easy ways to complete certain tasks. Initially, you will learn that you can model anything manually, but it's good to realize early on that not everything you can do is worth doing. One phrase I really like is, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Essentially, it means if you already have a quick and practical way to complete a task, save your time and use it. If you don't waste time to solving problems you already have solution for, you will soon be dedicating your time to solving real challenges and improving your model. Eventually, I did like to share some tools and add-ons I use. Maybe I will show them in a future video. Let's talk a bit about face orientation. It's always a good idea to check if your object's faces are correctly oriented. Incorrect face orientation can cause issues not just while modeling your object, but also when exporting it to other platforms. In Blender, for example, incorrect face orientation can interfere with actions like applying a bevel. When it comes to exporting, many engines have a default settings where materials are only applied to one side of object's faces. This means you might encounter part of your model that appear invisible or even transparent without understanding why. Of course, as far as I know, every engine has an option to apply texture to both sides of a face. However, this consumes far more resources than necessary and doesn't always produce the desired effect. Sometimes you might want to set up a specific configuration where there's an interaction with just one side of your object, and this could lead to visual bugs. Fixing face orientation in Blender is relatively straightforward. However, UV maps can give you quite a headache if you are not sure what you're doing. UV maps tell your model how textures should behave when applied. I will admit, I avoided learning about this for a long time, convincing myself that everything I created in Blender would stay there or just be rendered as video, and I was wrong. Once I realized how simple UV mapping could be, I felt pretty foolish for having avoided it for so long. There are many ways to deal with UV maps. In Blender, for instance, there's a set of options that automatically generate patterns for them. Often, you just pick one and you are good to go. However, when automatic options aren't enough, that's when the shader editor nodes come into play. But before diving into shaders, let's discuss baking. I use it to avoid baking materials because it's a slow process on my computer and I found it exhausting to bake every single object. For those who don't know, baking is the process of converting your object material into image-based texture which you can then use in other places. Depending on the shader's quality, 1024 or 2K, rendering could take a long time. If there were bump nodes involved, oh boy. But believe it or not, baking your texture, no matter how time-consuming, saves you a lot of trouble in the future. People with weaker PCs often think that if something takes a long time, it's better to focus on something else. However, when it comes to texture baking, the opposite is true. Blender requires significantly more computational power to calculate a texture using multiple nodes in real time. So, baking texture helps alleviate this strain, especially if you are working on a weaker PC like me. But to optimize your time, you need to avoid baking texture randomly or unnecessary. Assuming you've already set up your materials, here's the method I use for efficient texture baking. First, I use an add-on called Principled Baker. It greatly simplifies baking in Blender and can handle multiple textures at once. Keep in mind that you only work with Cycle, that's the only engine Blender allows for baking. Always remember the texture follow your object's UV map. I mention this because, like many others, including myself, you might download a texture and wonder why it's all messed up on your model. My second step involves creating a plane object. This is the trick. I select the plane, apply my material to it, and then use the add-on to bake the texture. This exports my material in the plane's UV layout, with the square by default. This way, I can easily reuse the same texture on other objects without any hassle. This method is exactly useful for all kinds of projects. For example, my asset libraries includes around 70 materials at 2K resolution, woods, metals, logos, colors, paints, and so on. If you make it a habit to bake every new material you like, you will soon find yourself rarely needing to bake anything new. This is where I emphasize that all the little tips I've shared can come together to form solid modeling habits. I'm not a guru who can guarantee that following that step will improve your skills by 100%, but they've helped me and I hope they help you too. If you make this practice a habit, you will avoid some of the problems I faced. Repeating something often enough turns it into second nature, and you will start doing it without even realizing it. So cultivate good habits instead of bad ones, and this advice applies not just to 3D modeling but to the life in general. To summarize everything I've shared with you, let's make a checklist. Here goes. Plan your project carefully before start. Simplify your workflow by learning method and using reference. Whenever something doesn't work as it should, check face orientation and UV maps. And always bake your textures. Many of the things I mentioned here will naturally arise during your learning process, whether you are using Blender or another tool. However, I genuinely hope that sharing of my experience helps you feel less lost. With that said, don't forget to subscribe the channel, give your like, share the video, and check out my social media link in the description to stay updated. See you next time!